The sirens were getting closer, and I could hear my sister-in-law screaming something about lawyers through the front door. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I stared at the stack of bank statements spread across my kitchen table, each one proof of what they'd done. The baby kicked hard against my ribs, as if reminding me I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. 3 months earlier, I'd buried the love of my life and thought grief was the worst thing I'd ever face. I had no idea the real nightmare was just beginning. Let me take you back to when everything still made sense. My name doesn't matter much to this story, but what happened to me might save someone else. I was 62 years old, living in a modest ranch house in Phoenix that Tom and I had bought 30 years ago. We'd raised our kids there, celebrated every holiday, painted the walls 3 different colors, trying to get it just right. The mesquite tree in the backyard had grown so tall it shaded half the patio. Everything about that house was us, woven together. Tom was my high school sweetheart, the kind of man who still brought me coffee in bed on Sundays and knew exactly how I liked my eggs. I can still remember the first time I saw him, standing by his locker in 10th grade, all lanky limbs and nervous energy. He'd dropped his books, and I'd helped him pick them up, and that was it. We were inseparable from that moment on. Through proms and graduations, through my father's disapproval and his mother's constant meddling, through every up and down that life threw at us, we stuck together. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. His pension from the railroad, my part-time work at the library, our savings. We had plans, you know. We were going to take that trip to the Grand Canyon we'd been putting off. We were going to finally remodel the bathroom. Tom had this whole list of projects he wanted to tackle once he fully retired. Building a greenhouse for my tomatoes, restoring the old pickup truck that had been sitting in the garage for 5 years, maybe even getting a dog now that the kids were grown and we had time to train one properly. We were going to grow old together, watching our grandkids play in that same backyard. I remember our last normal morning together like it was yesterday. It was a Tuesday in early February. Tom made pancakes, even though it wasn't the weekend. He said he'd woken up craving them, and who was I to argue? We sat at the kitchen table, syrup dripping down our chins, laughing at some silly joke he'd heard at the railroad yard. The sunlight was streaming through the window, catching the silver in his hair. He looked at me with those warm brown eyes and said, "You know what? I'm the luckiest man alive." I told him he was being sentimental. He told me he was being truthful. That was Tom. Even after 40 years, he could still make me feel like I was the only woman in the world. Then Tom had a heart attack at 68, sudden and massive, and he was gone before the ambulance even arrived. I remember the metallic taste in my mouth when the paramedic looked at me and shook his head. Everything went cold. The world kept spinning, but I was frozen in place, stuck in that moment where the love of my life stopped being a person and became a memory. It happened in the garage. He'd been working on changing the oil in his truck when I heard the crash. I can still hear the sound of the wrench hitting the concrete floor. By the time I got there, he was already unconscious, his face gray, his breathing shallow and labored. I called 911, my fingers barely able to dial the numbers. I tried to remember CPR from that class we'd taken at the community center years ago, but my hands were shaking too badly. I held him and I begged him not to leave me. I told him we still had so much to do together. He didn't answer. He never answered again. The funeral was a blur of black dresses and casseroles. Tom's sister Karen took charge of everything, which I was grateful for at the time. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't remember if I'd eaten or what day it was. The simplest tasks felt impossible. Getting dressed in the morning took all the energy I had. Karen handled the service, the flowers, the reception at the VFW hall. She chose the casket, picked out the music, wrote the obituary. At the time, I thought she was being kind, taking these burdens off my shoulders. Looking back, I can see she was establishing control from the very beginning. His brother Mike flew in from Tucson with his wife. His cousins came. Distant relatives I hadn't seen in years showed up, all offering condolences and hugs that felt stiff and obligatory. But they were there, and I thought that meant something. I thought family was supposed to hold you up when you couldn't stand on your own. I remember standing by the casket at the viewing, looking at Tom's face. They'd done a good job with the makeup, but it wasn't really him. Tom's face had laugh lines and sun damage from years of working outdoors. This face was smooth and waxy and still. I wanted to shake him awake, to tell him this wasn't funny anymore, to demand he open his eyes and tell me it was all some terrible joke. People kept coming up to me saying he looked peaceful. He didn't look peaceful. He looked gone. There's a difference, and anyone who's lost someone knows what I mean. Karen was everywhere that day, greeting people at the door, directing them to sign the guest book, making sure everyone had coffee and cookies during the reception. She introduced herself as Tom's sister, helping the family through this difficult time. I noticed how she phrased it, the family, not just me. At the time, I thought I was reading too much into it. Now I know better. I didn't know they were already circling like vultures. The first hint came 2 weeks after we buried Tom. I was sitting in our living room, still wearing his old flannel shirt because it smelled like him, when Karen stopped by unannounced. She had this folder under her arm, all official looking, and she sat down across from me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, but something else underneath it, something harder. She started with small talk, asked how I was sleeping, if I was eating enough, whether I'd been to the doctor. I gave her vague answers because, honestly, I didn't know. The days blurred together. Sometimes I'd find myself standing in a room with no memory of why I'd gone there. Sometimes I'd realize I'd been staring at the TV for hours without actually seeing what was on the screen. Grief does strange things to your brain. Then she told me she'd been going through Tom's papers, trying to help me sort things out. This should have been my first warning sign. Why would she be going through Tom's papers? They were in our home office, in filing cabinets only Tom and I had ever touched. But I was too foggy to question it. She said there were some decisions that needed to be made about his pension, about the house, about our accounts. She spoke slowly, like I was a child, or someone who didn't speak English very well. She kept patting my hand, and then she said something that made my stomach drop. She said Tom had told her, before he died, that he wanted to make sure his family was taken care of. His family, not our family. His. I remember the hum of the refrigerator suddenly seeming so loud in the silence that followed. I asked her what she meant, and she just smiled this tight little smile and said we'd talk about it more when I was feeling better. She left the folder on the coffee table and showed herself out. I sat there for an hour, maybe more, staring at that folder like it was a snake coiled up and ready to strike. The folder was brown, the kind you'd get at any office supply store, but it felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with the weight of the papers inside. It felt heavy with implications, with changes I didn't understand yet, but could sense coming like a storm on the horizon. My hands hovered over it several times before I finally pulled them back. Not today, I told myself. I'll look tomorrow when my head is clearer, but my head never got clearer. That's what grief does. It fills your skull with cotton and makes everything feel impossible. Have you ever had that feeling where you know something's wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on it? That's where I was. Everything felt off balance, like the house had shifted on its foundation while I wasn't paying attention. I want to stop here and say something to anyone listening who's going through grief right now. You're vulnerable in ways you can't even comprehend. Your brain isn't working right. You're running on autopilot, just trying to survive each day. And there are people who know that, who will use that against you. I'm not saying everyone is cruel, but some people see an opportunity where others see tragedy. Watch for them. Trust your gut when something feels wrong, even when you're too tired to fight. That folder sat on my coffee table for 3 days before I could bring myself to open it. Inside were photocopies of documents I'd never seen before, account statements, insurance policies, a will that I didn't remember Tom ever mentioning. The will was dated 6 months before he died, and according to what I was reading, he'd left almost everything to a family trust that Karen and Mike controlled. The house would go into the trust. His pension would be managed by the trust. Even our savings account, the one we'd built up over decades of careful budgeting and sacrifices, was supposed to go into this trust. I read it 3 times, 4 times, trying to make sense of it. This wasn't the man I'd married. Tom and I had made plans together. We'd talked about what would happen if one of us died first. He'd promised me I'd be taken care of, that I wouldn't have to worry. This document made me out to be incompetent, incapable of managing my own life. It treated me like a burden that needed to be handled. There was a clause in there, buried in the legal language, that particularly stung. It said something about my advancing age and potential cognitive decline, making it necessary to have responsible family members manage the estate. I read that line over and over, feeling anger bubble up through the grief fog. Advancing age? I was 62, not 92. Potential cognitive decline. I'd never shown any signs of dementia or confusion. I'd been sharp as a tack my whole life, managing household finances, helping the kids with college applications, balancing checkbooks down to the penny. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the papers. I called Karen, and she answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting. I asked her to explain, and her voice had this practiced quality to it, like she'd rehearsed what she was going to say. She told me Tom had been worried about me. He'd been concerned I wouldn't be able to handle everything on my own at my age. He wanted to make sure professionals managed the money so I wouldn't make any mistakes. She made it sound so reasonable, so caring. She made me sound like I was losing my mind to even question it. "You have to understand," Karen said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Tom was just trying to protect you. He knew how hard it would be for you to manage everything alone. The house maintenance, the bills, the investments. It's a lot for anyone, especially someone your age. Someone my age." There it was again. Like 62 was ancient. Like I'd suddenly become incapable overnight. I wanted to scream at her that I'd been managing our household finances for 40 years. I'd raised 3 kids on a tight budget. I'd never bounced a check in my life. I'd worked, saved, planned, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, I just said okay and hung up. I sat there in the dark living room, with Tom's empty recliner across from me, and I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my entire life. You know what the worst part was? I believed her. I believed that maybe Tom had lost faith in me. Maybe I really was too old, too worn out, too fragile to handle adult responsibilities. I'd turned 62 the month before he died. My knees hurt when I climbed stairs. I forgot where I put my reading glasses half the time. Maybe I was sliding into incompetence, and everyone could see it except me. That's what they were counting on. I stopped fighting. I signed papers Karen brought over. I nodded when Mike explained how the trust would work. I let them take over Tom's pension paperwork, his life insurance claim, everything. What choice did I have? They were family. They'd been at the funeral. They'd cried at the graveside. They couldn't be lying to me, could they? I think about this now, and I want to shake my past self. I want to scream at her to wake up, to fight, to ask questions. But that's not how it works when you're in it. When you're drowning, you'll grab onto any hand that reaches out, even if it's the same hand pushing you under. The next few weeks were a fog. I moved through my days like a ghost. I'd wake up and forget Tom was gone, then remember and feel the grief crash over me all over again. I stopped cooking real meals. I'd eat crackers standing at the kitchen counter. I'd fall asleep on the couch with the TV on. The house felt enormous and empty and suffocating all at once. The nights were the worst. I'd lie in our bed, on my side, staring at the empty space where Tom should have been. Sometimes I'd reach over, forgetting, expecting to feel the warmth of his body. My hand would hit cold sheets, and the reality would crash down again. I started sleeping on the couch because I couldn't stand that nightly reminder of his absence. But the couch wasn't much better. Everywhere I looked, there was something that reminded me of him: his reading glasses on the end table, his favorite mug in the kitchen cabinet, his jacket still hanging by the back door. Karen came by every few days with more papers to sign. She'd bring store-bought cookies and sit with me for exactly 20 minutes, then leave with whatever signature she needed. Mike called once a week to check in, always asking if I needed anything, never offering anything specific. Tom's cousin Janet sent a card. The neighbors stopped bringing casseroles. Life went on for everyone else, and I was stuck in this strange limbo where nothing felt real. Each time Karen visited, the pattern was the same. She'd let herself in with the spare key Tom had given her years ago, something I'd completely forgotten about. She'd call out in that bright, fake voice, "Just me, thought I'd check on you." She'd set down her purse, arrange the cookies on a plate like we were having some kind of social visit, and then pull out whatever document needed signing that day. "This one's for the insurance company," she'd say, or, "The bank needs this to transfer the accounts to the trust." Or, "Just a formality for the pension office." And I'd sign. I'd sign because I was tired and confused and I trusted her. I'd sign because questioning her felt like too much effort. I'd sign because I'd been raised to believe that family helped each other, and this was her helping me. I gave up my part-time job at the library. Karen suggested it might be too much for me right now, and I agreed. Why wouldn't I? I could barely remember to pay the electric bill. The idea of shelving books and helping patrons find what they needed seemed impossible. So I quit, and with it went the last piece of my routine, the last thing that got me out of the house and around other people. Looking back, I can see what a mistake that was. The library had been my lifeline. It got me out of bed in the morning. It gave me a reason to shower and dress and leave the house. It connected me with people who had nothing to do with Tom's family, people who liked me for me, not because of who I was married to. Claire was there, other co-workers who checked in and asked how I was really doing, patrons who knew me by name and chatted about books and the weather and normal everyday things that had nothing to do with death and grief. But I quit. I let Karen convince me I was too fragile, too overwhelmed, too broken to work 4 hours a day shelving books and checking out materials. And once I did, my world shrank even more. I was isolating myself, but I didn't see it that way. I thought I was just tired. I thought I needed time to grieve. I thought 62 meant I'd earned the right to slow down, to let other people handle the hard stuff. That's the lie I told myself, and they encouraged it with every visit, every phone call, every sympathetic look. Looking back, I can see how deliberate it was. They were cutting me off from anyone who might question what they were doing. They were making me dependent on them for information, for guidance, for basic interaction. They were building a cage around me, and I was helping them do it. In early April, about 6 weeks after the funeral, I got a letter from the railroad pension office. It was addressed to me, which surprised me because Karen had said she was handling all of that. I almost threw it away unopened, figuring it was just some standard notification. But something made me tear it open. Maybe it was the last little spark of the woman I used to be, the one who paid attention to details and asked questions. The letter said my survivor benefit claim had been denied. Denied. I read it 3 times. It said that according to their records, Thomas Robert Morrison had designated his pension to go to a trust upon his death, and survivor benefits would be distributed according to the trust's terms, not directly to me. They suggested I contact the trust administrator for more information. My vision went blurry. I had to sit down because my legs suddenly felt like they couldn't support my weight. Denied. The word kept echoing in my head. Tom had worked for that railroad for 43 years. 43 years of early mornings and late nights, of physical labor that left him aching and exhausted. And I was entitled to nothing? How was that possible? I called Karen immediately. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. She didn't answer. I called Mike. Voicemail. I tried Karen again and left a message, trying to keep my voice steady, asking her to please call me back because I'd gotten this letter and I didn't understand what was happening. The wait was excruciating. I paced the living room, the letter clutched in my hand, scenarios running through my mind. Maybe there was a mistake. Maybe the railroad had the wrong information. Maybe this was just some bureaucratic mix-up that Karen could clear up with a phone call. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. She called back 3 hours later, and her voice had lost that fake warmth it usually carried. She was clipped, almost irritated. She told me not to worry about it, that she and Mike were handling everything, that I'd get my money when the trust was properly set up. She said these things take time. She said I needed to be patient. But something had shifted in me. That letter had cut through the fog just enough to let a little light in. I asked her when, exactly, the trust would be set up. I asked her how much I'd be getting each month. I asked her why Tom would have set it up this way without telling me. And she got angry, actually angry. Her voice went sharp, all pretense of concern dropping away. She said I was being ungrateful. She said she and Mike were doing me a favor, that they had their own lives and families to worry about, that I should be thankful they were taking time out of their busy schedules to help me. The word help came out like a slap. Then she hung up on me. I sat there with the phone in my hand, and for the first time since Tom died, I felt something other than grief. I felt anger, real, hot, clarifying anger. Who did she think she was? This was my life, my home, my money. Tom had worked for 43 years at that railroad. He'd come home with aching joints and sore muscles. He'd worked double shifts when we needed extra money. That pension was supposed to take care of me, not line some trust that his siblings controlled. I pulled out every piece of paper Karen had given me over the past 6 weeks. I spread them across the dining room table. I read every word, and slowly, painfully, the picture came into focus. They'd been planning this. While Tom was still alive, somehow they'd convinced him to sign these documents. Or maybe they'd forged his signature. I didn't know which was worse. But every document funneled his assets away from me and into their control. The house, the pension, the life insurance, the savings account, everything. As I laid out the papers, patterns started to emerge. Dates that didn't quite line up. Signatures that looked slightly different from one document to another. References to conversations Tom supposedly had with Karen that I'd never heard about. It was like discovering evidence of a parallel version of my husband, one who'd secretly doubted me and planned to strip me of everything we'd built together. Except I knew Tom. I'd known him for over 40 years. This didn't sound like him at all. I felt sick, physically sick. I barely made it to the bathroom before I threw up. I ended up on the cold tile floor, shaking, crying, unable to catch my breath. How could they do this? How could family do this? I'd known Karen for over 40 years. I'd been at her kids' baptisms. I'd loaned them money when Mike was out of work. I'd sent birthday cards and Christmas presents and shown up for every family event. And this was how they repaid me? But here's the thing, and I need you to hear this if you're in a situation that feels even remotely similar. None of that mattered to them. Family isn't always blood. Sometimes the people who share your DNA are the ones who will hurt you the worst because they know exactly where to strike. They know your weaknesses, your fears, your blind spots. And they'll use all of it without hesitation if there's something in it for them. I don't know how long I lay on that bathroom floor. The sun moved across the sky. The shadows changed. The tile was hard and cold beneath me, and I remember thinking how fitting that was. Everything in my life had turned hard and cold. Eventually, I got up, washed my face, and made myself a cup of tea. The simple act of putting the kettle on, of choosing a tea bag from the box Tom had bought last month, of adding just the right amount of honey, these mundane tasks anchored me back to reality. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Tom and I had shared thousands of meals, and I let the steam from the tea rise into my face. My hands were still shaking, but my mind was clearing. The fog that had surrounded me for weeks was lifting, burned away by the heat of my anger. I could think again. I could see again. And what I saw terrified me. I needed help, real help, not from family. Not from anyone Tom and I had been close to, because I couldn't trust who else might be in on this. I needed someone with no stake in the outcome, someone who could look at this objectively and tell me if I was crazy or if something genuinely wrong was happening. I thought about calling my daughter, but she lived in Seattle with her own family, and I didn't want to burden her. She had 3 kids under 10 and a demanding job. The last thing she needed was her mother falling apart and dragging her into family drama. I thought about calling Tom's old friend from the railroad, but he and Karen had always been close. I felt paralyzed by the realization that I didn't know who to trust. Isolation isn't just about being physically alone. It's about being cut off from people who can help you see clearly when your vision is compromised. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept going over everything in my mind, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. Had Tom really wanted this? Had he lost faith in me? Or had they manipulated him somehow? He'd been getting forgetful toward the end, mixing up dates and names. Nothing serious, just normal aging. But maybe they'd used that against him. Maybe they'd convinced him I was worse off than I was. I remember one conversation, maybe 8 months before he died, when Karen had come over for Sunday dinner. She'd started talking about a friend of hers whose mother had dementia, how terrible it was, how the woman couldn't remember her own children. And then she'd turned to Tom and said, "You know, it's so important to plan ahead. You never know when these things will start." The way she'd looked at me when she said it. I'd felt uncomfortable then, but I'd brushed it off as paranoia. Now I wondered if that was the beginning. If that was when they started planting seeds of doubt in Tom's mind. Your wife is getting older. She forgets things. You need to protect her from herself. How many conversations like that had they had? How many times had they whispered concerns about my mental state, my competence, my ability to handle life without him? Or maybe, and this was the thought that hurt the most, maybe he'd just never trusted me to begin with. Maybe after 40 years of partnership, he'd secretly believed I was incapable all along. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to fight. I didn't know how yet, and I didn't know if I'd win, but I couldn't just roll over and let them take everything. I'd spent 40 years being Tom's wife, raising his children, keeping his home. I'd sacrificed my own career ambitions to be there for family dinners and school plays and Little League games. I'd been accepted to nursing school when I was 22. Did you know that? I had a full scholarship and everything, but then I got pregnant with our first child, and Tom's mother made it very clear that proper wives didn't work outside the home, especially not with young children. Tom had supported me. He'd said it was my choice, but I could see the relief in his eyes when I said I'd defer. And then one deferral became permanent, and nursing school became a dream I'd had once, long ago. I'd put everyone else first for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to put myself anywhere on the list at all. Well, that was ending. Right now. This fight wasn't just about money or the house or Tom's pension. It was about reclaiming all those years of putting myself last, of making myself small, of accepting that my dreams mattered less than everyone else's comfort. I started keeping a journal. I wrote down every interaction with Karen and Mike, every phone call, every visit, every paper they asked me to sign. I documented dates and times. I kept copies of everything. I opened a new bank account at a different bank, one they didn't know about. and I moved what little money I had access to into it. It wasn't much, just a few $100s from odd jobs and my last paycheck from the library, but it was mine, and they couldn't touch it. The act of opening that account felt revolutionary. I drove to a bank on the other side of town, one I'd never used before. I walked in and told the customer service representative I needed to open an account in my name only. She smiled and pulled out the forms. It was such a simple thing, but it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. This account had my name on it, only my name. No trust, no Karen, no Mike, just me. I also started paying attention to what I was eating and how I was taking care of myself. I realized I'd lost almost 15 pounds since Tom died. My clothes hung off me. My hair was a mess. I looked like someone's sick grandmother, which is probably exactly how they wanted me to look. Weak, helpless, incompetent. So I started eating regular meals again. I forced myself to shower every day, small acts of self-preservation that felt huge. You're probably wondering why I didn't just hire a lawyer. The truth is, I didn't think I could afford one. And I was scared. What if a lawyer looked at all the papers I'd signed and said there was nothing I could do? What if fighting back made everything worse? These were the thoughts that kept me up at night, that made my chest tight with anxiety. Fear is a powerful paralytic, and they were counting on me being too afraid to challenge them. But then, something happened that changed everything. It was late April, and my friend Claire from the library called to check on me. We'd worked together for almost 10 years, and she was one of those genuinely kind people who remembered everyone's birthday and brought in homemade soup when someone was sick. "I know you said you needed space," she started, her voice warm and concerned, "but I've been thinking about you, really thinking about you, and I just wanted to hear your voice." She asked how I was doing, and I gave her the standard answer. Fine, managing, taking it day by day. But Claire had always been perceptive, and she heard something in my voice. "No," she said firmly. "How are you really doing?" Not the answer you give to acquaintances at the grocery store. The real answer. And something in me just broke. Maybe it was because Claire had no connection to Tom's family. Maybe it was because I'd been holding everything in for so long. Maybe it was just because someone finally asked and actually wanted to know. She pressed me gently, asking if there was anything she could help with, and before I knew it, I was telling her everything. About the trust, about Karen and Mike, about the pension, about feeling lost and helpless and trapped. The words came tumbling out, faster and faster, like a dam breaking. I told her about the documents, about Tom supposedly not trusting me, about being cut off from my own money. I told her about feeling incompetent and old and useless. I told her about the nursing school scholarship I'd given up, about 40 years of putting myself last, about waking up at 62 and realizing I didn't even know who I was anymore outside of being Tom's wife. I told her things I hadn't even fully admitted to myself yet, and Claire just listened, not interrupting, not judging, just letting me pour it all out. Claire listened without interrupting, and when I finally ran out of words, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I'll never forget. She said her son had just finished law school and passed the bar exam. He was looking to build his practice, and he owed her a favor because she'd helped him study for the bar. She said if I wanted, she'd ask him to take a look at my situation, no charge, just as a favor to her. She said I deserved to at least know where I stood. I almost said no. Almost. The instinct to not be a burden, to not ask for help, to just accept what was happening was so strong. But something in me, that little spark of anger that had ignited when I got that letter, pushed through. I said yes. Thank you. Please. Claire's son, David, came to my house 3 days later. He was in his late 20s, earnest and professional in a suit that looked brand new. He had his mother's kind eyes, but a sharp intelligence that put me immediately at ease. He sat at my dining room table and listened to my story. He looked at every document, He took notes. He asked questions I hadn't thought to ask. And the more he read, the darker his expression became. After about 2 hours, he looked up at me and said, very gently, that what had been done to me was likely illegal. He said the documents appeared to have been signed under duress or possibly fraud. He said Tom's will contradicted earlier estate planning documents he'd found reference to in some of the paperwork. He said the way the trust was structured violated Arizona state law in several ways, and he said that if I wanted to fight this, he thought we had a good chance of winning. I started crying. Not sad crying, but relief crying. Someone believed me. Someone saw what I was seeing. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't incompetent. I was being taken advantage of, and there were laws against that. David waited until I could speak again. Then he laid out a plan. He said we needed to gather more evidence. We needed to prove that Tom either didn't understand what he was signing or was coerced into signing it. We needed to show that Karen and Mike had been dishonest about their intentions. And we needed to do it quietly, without tipping them off, until we had everything we needed. I felt hope for the first time in months. Real hope, not the fragile, wishful thinking I'd been surviving on. This was solid, actionable, real. David told me he'd work on this pro bono as a favor to his mother, and because, in his words, he didn't go to law school to let bullies win. I could have kissed him. Over the next few weeks, David and I became a team. He taught me what to look for in documents, what questions to ask, how to protect myself legally. I started recording my phone calls with Karen and Mike, which is legal in Arizona as long as one party consents, and I was that party. I documented everything they said, every contradiction, every time they promised something and then didn't deliver, every time they tried to make me feel stupid or incompetent. David showed me how to organize evidence, how to create a timeline. We set up a spreadsheet tracking every document, every phone call, every interaction. It felt empowering to see it all laid out like that, to turn my confused grief and anger into something concrete and actionable. For the first time since Tom died, I felt like I had some control over what was happening to me. We met twice a week at my kitchen table, spreading out documents and building our case. David would arrive with his leather briefcase and his legal pads, and I'd make coffee. We developed a rhythm, a partnership. He treated me like an equal, not like someone who needed to be protected or managed. He asked for my input, valued my observations, taught me the legal terminology so I could understand exactly what was happening. "You're good at this," he told me one afternoon, after I'd spotted an inconsistency in dates that he'd missed. "You have an eye for detail. You should have been a lawyer yourself." I laughed, but his words meant more to me than he probably realized. Someone saw me as competent. Someone valued my intelligence. After months of being treated like I was losing my mind, David's respect felt like water in a desert. And here's where it gets interesting. David suggested we send requests to the railroad pension office, to the insurance company, to the bank, asking for copies of every document Tom had signed in the last 2 years of his life. We invoked my rights as his widow. And when those documents came back, we found discrepancies, big ones, signatures that didn't quite match, dates that didn't line up, a paper trail that suggested someone had been very carefully manipulating things behind the scenes. I remember the day we got the smoking gun. It was a document from the railroad dated 8 months before Tom died, showing he'd updated his beneficiary to me, just me. No trust mentioned anywhere. But Karen had a document dated 6 months before he died that contradicted this. 2 different versions of the truth, and only one could be real. David sent both to a forensic document examiner, and the results came back exactly as we suspected. The later document, the one Karen had, showed signs of alteration. Someone had changed it after Tom signed it. The forensic examiner's report was detailed and damning. It pointed out inconsistencies in the ink, variations in pressure that suggested different pens had been used, subtle differences in Tom's signature that indicated it might have been traced or copied. The examiner concluded with 95% certainty that the document had been altered after the initial signature was placed. I felt vindicated and furious all at once. They hadn't just manipulated a grieving man. They'd committed fraud, actual criminal fraud, and they'd thought they could get away with it because I was just a tired old widow who wouldn't know any better. By mid-June, David had built a case. We had evidence of fraud, evidence of elder abuse, evidence of financial exploitation. We had testimony from Tom's doctor saying he'd been of sound mind up until the day he died. We had the forensic report on the documents. We had everything we needed to not just challenge the trust, but to potentially see Karen and Mike face criminal charges. David advised me that we had two options. We could go to court and fight this publicly, which would be messy and painful and would tear the family apart even more than it already was. Or we could confront them privately first, show them what we had, and give them a chance to make this right before we involved the authorities. He left the choice up to me. I thought about it for a long time. Part of me wanted to burn it all down, to make them pay publicly for what they'd done. I imagined headlines, courtroom drama, the satisfaction of watching them squirm under oath. But another part of me, the part that had spent 40 years trying to keep the peace and hold the family together, wanted to give them one chance to do the right thing. So I chose the private confrontation. David helped me draft a letter, and I had him send it to Karen and Mike as my attorney. It was formal and cold and laid out exactly what we'd found and what we could prove. It gave them 72 hours to respond. The next 3 days were the longest of my life. I jumped every time the phone rang. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining how they'd react. Would they deny it? Would they try to intimidate me? Would they just ignore it and hope I'd back down? I walked around the house like a caged animal, unable to settle. I'd pick up a book and read the same page 3 times without absorbing a single word. I'd turn on the TV and stare at it blankly. I cleaned the kitchen twice in one day just to have something to do with my hands. The waiting was torture. On the morning of the 3rd day, Karen showed up at my door. Mike was with her. They looked terrible, like they hadn't slept either. Karen's makeup was smeared, her eyes red-rimmed. Mike's shirt was wrinkled, his expression haggard. I let them in, and we sat in the living room where this had all started. Karen didn't waste time with pleasantries. She asked if I was really going to do this, if I was really going to destroy the family over money. I looked her right in the eye and said it wasn't about money. It was about them treating me like I was too stupid to notice I was being robbed. Mike tried to play the reasonable one. He said they'd just been trying to help, that they thought it was what Tom wanted. I showed them the forensic report. I showed them the timeline of contradicting documents. I asked them to explain how helping me involved forging my dead husband's signature and lying about what he'd wanted. They couldn't. They just sat there, and I watched Karen's face go through about 5 different emotions before landing on defeated. She admitted it. Not all of it, not the worst of it, but enough. She said they'd convinced Tom to set up the trust because they didn't think I could handle everything alone. She said they'd made some changes to documents after he died because they thought it would simplify things. She said they never meant to hurt me. Every word out of her mouth made me angrier because she was still trying to make it sound like they'd had good intentions, still trying to make me feel like I was overreacting. Tom was worried, Karen said, her voice weak and defensive. He told me he was concerned about leaving you alone with all those responsibilities. When? I demanded. When did he tell you this? What exact conversation? Because Tom told me every day that I was the strongest person he knew. He trusted me with everything. So when, exactly, did he supposedly say I was incompetent? She couldn't answer. She looked at Mike, who looked at the floor. I told them they had 2 choices. They could sign over complete control of everything back to me, including the house, the pension, the insurance, all of it, or I would take everything we'd found to the police and let the courts sort it out. I told them David had already drafted the papers that would dissolve the trust and restore my rights to everything Tom had actually left me. And I told them they had 24 hours to decide. They tried to negotiate. Mike said they'd put money into managing everything, that they deserved compensation. I laughed. I actually laughed, because the audacity was breathtaking. I told them they could either sign the papers or hire their own lawyer and explain to a judge why they'd forged documents and stolen from a widow. Karen started crying, saying I was being cruel, that we were family. And that's when I lost it. I told her that family doesn't steal. Family doesn't lie. Family doesn't make you feel like you're losing your mind. I told her to get out of my house and not come back unless it was to sign those papers. They left, and I collapsed on the couch. I was shaking so badly I couldn't stand. David had been in the kitchen during the whole conversation, there as my lawyer and my backup in case things went south. He came out and sat with me until I could breathe normally again. He said I'd done great. He said most people couldn't stand up to family like that. But I didn't feel great. I felt gutted and exhausted and sad in a way that had nothing to do with Tom being gone, and everything to do with realizing the people I'd trusted had betrayed me. The next afternoon, Karen and Mike showed up with their own lawyer. They signed the papers, every single one. The trust was dissolved. Everything Tom had actually left me was restored to my name alone. They didn't speak to me. They didn't look at me. They just signed and left. Their lawyer was professional and cold, and I could tell he'd advised them that fighting this would only make things worse for them. David filed all the paperwork with the railroad, with the insurance company, with the bank. Within 2 weeks, I started receiving the survivor benefits I should have been getting from day one. The life insurance payout came through. I had access to our savings account. The house was mine, clear and simple. On paper, I'd won. But victory felt hollow. I'd lost my husband, and now I'd lost his family too. My kids were caught in the middle, trying to understand why their aunts and uncle had done this to me. Family gatherings were over. Holidays would never be the same. I'd gained my financial independence and lost the illusion of family unity. A lot of people asked me if I thought it was worth it, if the money was worth the cost of those relationships. And here's what I want you to understand. It wasn't about the money. It was about my dignity. It was about refusing to be treated like I was less than, like I didn't matter, like my 40 years of marriage and sacrifice meant nothing. It was about standing up and saying, no, you don't get to do this to me, no matter who you are. There's a moment every victim of exploitation faces. It's the moment when you decide if you're going to accept what's happening or fight back. And fighting back is terrifying. It's exhausting. It costs you things you never wanted to lose. But accepting it costs you something worse. It costs you yourself. I spent the summer rebuilding my life, not the life I'd had with Tom, because that was gone forever. Not the life I'd imagined, because that was built on illusions. A new life, one where I was in control, where I made the decisions, where I didn't have to ask permission or justify my choices. The first week after everything was settled, I woke up every morning with a sense of disorientation. The legal battle was over. Karen and Mike were out of my life. The house was mine. The money was mine. But who was I now? For months, I'd been defined by the fight. I'd been the woman fighting back against family betrayal. Now that the fight was over, I had to figure out who I wanted to be. I started taking better care of myself. I joined a gym and started walking every morning. At first, I could barely make it around the block. My legs were weak from months of inactivity, my lungs unused to the exertion. But I kept at it. Every day, I went a little further. I watched the sun come up over the desert, felt the dry Arizona air fill my lungs, and reminded myself with every step that I was still here. I was still fighting. Not against Karen and Mike anymore, but for myself, for the woman I wanted to become. I found a grief support group and made new friends who understood loss without trying to take advantage of it. There was Margaret, who'd lost her husband of 50 years to Alzheimer's. There was James, a retired teacher whose wife had died in a car accident. There was Paula, whose partner had passed from cancer. We met every Thursday evening in a church basement, sitting in a circle of uncomfortable folding chairs, and we shared our pain without judgment. These people became my lifeline. They understood the weight of grief without trying to exploit it. They listened when I needed to talk and sat in comfortable silence when words felt impossible. They celebrated small victories with me. The first time I laughed at something, the first time I could talk about Tom without crying, the first time I realized I'd gone a whole hour without thinking about Karen and Mike's betrayal. I also started volunteering at a legal aid clinic, helping other people navigate the kind of situation I'd just escaped. David introduced me to the lawyers there, and they welcomed me with open arms. Turns out there are a lot of older people, especially women, who get taken advantage of by family members after a spouse dies. A 2014 study found that almost 4 in 10 seniors have experienced some form of verbal abuse, and when you add in financial exploitation and emotional manipulation, the numbers get even worse. I wasn't special. I was part of a statistical pattern of people who trusted the wrong people. But here's the thing about statistics. Each one represents a real person with a real story and real pain. And every single one of those people deserves to be fought for, to be believed, to be helped. So I started helping. I shared my story with anyone who'd listen. I learned about elder abuse laws and estate planning and how to protect yourself. I became the person I'd needed when all this started. My daughter flew down from Seattle in August to check on me, and she almost didn't recognize me. I'd gained back the weight I'd lost. I was tan from all the walking. I was smiling again. She said I looked younger than I had in years, and I told her that's what freedom does for you. We sat on the back patio, under that mesquite tree that Tom and I had planted 30 years ago, and I told her the whole story. Everything. She cried. She raged. She wanted to confront Karen and Mike herself. But mostly, she said she was proud of me. That meant more than any amount of money in any trust ever could. "Mom," she said, taking my hand, "I'm sorry I wasn't here. I should have come sooner. I should have seen what they were doing." I told her it wasn't her fault. I told her that predators are skilled at hiding their true intentions, especially from people who aren't nearby to see the day-to-day manipulation. I told her that what mattered was that I'd found my way through it, and now I was stronger for it. We spent the rest of her visit talking about things we'd never discussed before. My nursing school dreams, her own struggles balancing career and motherhood, the ways we'd both learned to make ourselves smaller to fit other people's expectations. It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had, and by the end of the week, I felt like I'd gained not just my financial independence, but a deeper relationship with my daughter. She saw me not just as her mother, but as a woman who'd fought for herself and won. I still miss Tom every single day. I still sleep on my side of the bed. I still make his favorite meals even though I'm cooking for one. Sometimes I set the table for 2 before I remember. Sometimes I hear a noise in the garage and think it's him working on one of his projects. Sometimes I reach for the phone to call him before reality crashes back in. Grief doesn't just go away because you won a fight or righted a wrong, but grief and anger can coexist, and so can grief and peace. I'm learning to hold all of it at once. I'm learning that I can miss him and still be angry about what happened. I can remember the good times and still acknowledge the betrayal. Life isn't simple, and neither are emotions. Looking back, I can see all the warning signs I missed. The way Karen took over the funeral arrangements without asking what I wanted. The way Mike always spoke to me like I was a child. The way they isolated me from other family members who might have questioned what they were doing. The way they made me doubt my own competence and judgment. These are classic tactics of financial predators, and they work because they rely on trust and shame and fear. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, please pay attention to that feeling. You're not being paranoid. You're not being ungrateful. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And you have every right to ask questions, to demand transparency, to protect yourself. Don't sign anything you don't fully understand. Don't let anyone rush you into decisions. Don't accept vague explanations or get brushed off when you ask for details. Your life, your assets, your future, these things belong to you, and nobody has the right to take them without your informed consent. I wish I could tell you that everything worked out perfectly, that I'm living some fairy tale ending now. The truth is more complicated. I'm 63 years old, widowed, estranged from half of Tom's family, and starting over in ways I never expected to at this age. Research shows that 80% of couples who divorce late in life need to delay retirement. And while I didn't divorce, I might as well have for all the financial disruption I went through. I'm working part-time again, rebuilding my savings, planning for a future that looks nothing like what I'd imagined. But I'm free. I'm in control of my own life. Nobody's manipulating me or lying to me or making me question my sanity. Nobody's treating me like I'm too old or too stupid or too fragile to make my own decisions. And that freedom, that dignity, that sense of self-worth, that's worth everything I lost to get it. I want to tell you about something important I learned through all of this, something that might help you or someone you know. Real steps to get out and rebuild are possible, but they require understanding the actual mechanics of how these situations develop and how to escape them. First, recognize that financial exploitation and emotional abuse don't happen overnight. They happen through a series of small steps, each one seeming reasonable in isolation, but forming a pattern of control. In my case, it started with Karen offering to help with funeral arrangements. Helpful, right? Then it was handling paperwork. Then it was making decisions about the house. Each step made me more dependent on them and less confident in my own judgment. The way out starts with documentation. Keep copies of everything. Start a journal of every interaction, every conversation, every decision that gets made about your life or your assets. Note dates, times, what was said, what you agreed to. This serves two purposes. It gives you a clear record if you need to take legal action, and it helps you see patterns you might miss when you're in survival mode. Next, rebuild your support network. Isolation is the abuser's most powerful tool. They cut you off from people who might question what's happening, who might empower you to fight back. Reconnect with old friends, join groups, find a community that isn't connected to the people exploiting you. I found mine at the library grief group and later at the legal aid clinic. These people had no agenda except to help me heal. Then, educate yourself about your legal rights. Every state has laws protecting vulnerable adults from exploitation. Every state has resources for people in these situations. You don't need to afford a fancy lawyer to get help. Legal aid societies, elder abuse hotlines, adult protective services. These exist specifically for situations like mine. David helped me pro bono, but even if Claire hadn't had a lawyer's son, I could have found help through the Arizona legal aid system. Financial protection is crucial. If you have any money at all that the abusers don't know about or can't access, secure it. Open an account at a different bank. Get a P.O. box for mail. Change passwords on all your accounts. Review your credit report for any accounts or loans you didn't authorize. In cases of family exploitation, identity theft is common. My situation didn't involve that, but many do. Understand that leaving or fighting back will cost you relationships. This is the hardest part. I lost Karen, Mike, their kids, their friends. Family events are awkward at best. Some people believe their version of events, where I'm the greedy widow who turned on family. That hurts, but staying would have cost me more. It would have cost me my home, my financial security, and my sense of self. You have to decide what you can live with and what you can't. Also know that recovery isn't linear. Some days I feel strong and capable. Other days I'm angry all over again. Sometimes I miss the illusion of family unity more than I can stand. Healing from betrayal, especially betrayal by people you trusted, takes time. Be patient with yourself. Get therapy if you can. I started seeing a counselor in July, and it's helped me process everything without feeling like I'm burdening my friends. Here's something specific that might save someone's life or future. If a family member suddenly wants to help manage your finances after a major life event like a death or illness, ask why. Ask for specifics. Ask to see everything in writing. If they get defensive or try to make you feel guilty for asking, that's a red flag. Real help is transparent and empowering, not secretive and controlling. And if you're reading this thinking about someone you know who might be in this situation, please reach out to them. Don't wait for them to ask for help, because they probably won't. Shame and fear keep people silent. Just check in. Ask how they're really doing. Offer specific help, like going through paperwork together or researching their legal rights. Let them know they're not alone and they're not crazy. That kind of support can literally save someone. The rebuilding part is real and possible, but it's work. Physical transformation helped me. Taking care of my body, getting stronger, feeling capable again. These weren't just about health. They were about reclaiming myself from people who'd tried to reduce me to a helpless burden. I started with walking 15 minutes a day, then 20, then 30. I joined a yoga class and met women my age who were also rebuilding after loss. We became friends. We support each other. I also had to rebuild my sense of competence. For months, Karen and Mike had told me I couldn't handle things, and I'd started to believe them. I made a list of everything I'd accomplished in my life: raising 3 kids, managing a household budget for 40 years, working, learning new skills, surviving. The list was longer than I expected, and seeing it in writing reminded me that I was capable. I'd always been capable. Financial rebuilding meant starting over in some ways. I'd lost months of pension payments I should have received. I'd lost access to savings during the time the trust controlled everything. But I also learned to budget differently, to plan for a future as a single person instead of half of a couple. I met with a financial advisor who specialized in widows' finances, and she helped me understand what I had and how to make it work. Most importantly, I rebuilt my boundaries. I learned to say no without explaining myself. I learned that I don't owe anyone access to my life or my decisions. I learned that protecting myself isn't selfish, it's necessary. These lessons cost me dearly to learn, but they've made me stronger than I ever was before. Before I end my story, I want to share something important I learned through all of this. The perspective I gained isn't just about what happened to me. It's about understanding the broader patterns of how people, especially women my age, get trapped in situations where family members exploit them financially and emotionally. What I experienced has a name: elder financial exploitation, and it's shockingly common. According to various studies, somewhere between 5% and 20% of older adults experience some form of financial abuse, and the real numbers are probably higher because so many cases go unreported. Why? Shame, fear, love. The same things that kept me quiet for months. Here's what I learned about how this happens and how to protect yourself. Financial exploitation by family members usually follows a pattern. It starts during a vulnerable time, after a death, during an illness, when someone is isolated or grieving. The exploiter positions themselves as helpful, as the only one who cares enough to handle the difficult stuff. They slowly take control of accounts, documents, decisions. They make the victim feel incompetent or ungrateful for questioning anything. They isolate the victim from other people who might notice what's happening. In my case, every single one of these tactics was used. Tom's death was the vulnerability. Karen and Mike positioned themselves as the responsible ones. They took control of everything they could. They made me feel like I was too old and too grief-stricken to handle my own life. And they cut me off from other family members and friends who might have questioned their actions. The warning signs are clear once you know what to look for. Sudden changes to financial documents. Family members who won't provide clear answers about money. Pressure to sign papers without reading them or having someone else review them. Being told you're not capable of making your own decisions. Isolation from other people who care about you. Unexplained withdrawals from accounts. Bills not being paid even though money should be available. If you see these signs in your own life or in someone else's life, act. Don't wait. Don't assume it will get better. Don't believe that family wouldn't really hurt you. In most cases of elder financial abuse, the abuser is a family member, usually an adult child, but siblings, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, anyone who has access and opportunity can be a predator. Specific steps to protect yourself. First, don't give anyone complete control of your finances unless you've thoroughly vetted them and have oversight mechanisms in place. If you need help managing your money, hire a professional fiduciary or financial advisor who is legally bound to act in your best interest. Family members have no such legal obligation. Second, maintain your own accounts that only you can access. Even if someone is helping you, keep one account that is entirely yours. This gives you options if things go wrong. I wish I'd done this from the beginning instead of letting Karen have access to everything. Third, require transparency. Any family member who is truly helping you should be willing to show you every transaction, every bill, every account statement. They should encourage your questions, not shut them down. They should want you to understand what's happening with your money. If they get defensive or secretive, that's a major red flag. Fourth, maintain relationships outside of the family members who are helping you. Keep in touch with friends, neighbors, other relatives, support groups. These connections can provide perspective and help when you need it. Predators hate outside observers because outside observers ask uncomfortable questions. Fifth, know your legal rights. Every state has an Adult Protective Services agency. Every state has elder abuse hotlines. Many states have ombudsman programs specifically for older adults. Find out what resources exist in your area before you need them. I didn't know about most of these until David told me, and by then I'd already lost months to the exploitation. Sixth, if something feels wrong, it probably is. Trust your instincts. You're not being paranoid or ungrateful. If someone is making you feel guilty for asking questions about your own money, that's manipulation. If someone is telling you you're too old or too incompetent to understand your own finances, that's gaslighting. You have every right to understand what's happening with your own assets. One specific thing that might help: create a financial safety plan while you're still healthy and thinking clearly. Document what you want to happen if you become ill or incapacitated. Choose who you trust to help you and build in oversight. Maybe 2 people who have to agree before any major financial decisions are made. Review your plan regularly and update it as circumstances change. Don't wait until crisis hits to figure this out. Also, understand the difference between helping and controlling. Real help empowers you to make your own decisions with good information. Real help is transparent. Real help encourages your independence even while providing support. Control masquerades as help, but actually makes you more dependent, more isolated, more vulnerable. Karen and Mike claimed they were helping me, but everything they did made me less capable of helping myself. If you're already in a situation where you think exploitation is happening, the first step is often the hardest: admitting it to yourself. The shame is overwhelming. You feel stupid for not seeing it sooner. You feel guilty for suspecting family members of bad intentions. You feel afraid of what will happen if you're wrong or if you confront them. All of these feelings are normal, and all of them keep you trapped. Push through them. Your future depends on it. Gather evidence quietly. Make copies of documents. Record conversations if it's legal in your state. Screenshot emails and text messages. Create a paper trail that shows what's happening. This protects you legally and helps you see the patterns clearly. When I finally laid out all the documents David and I had collected, the fraud was undeniable even to me, and I'd been living it. Seek help from someone who isn't involved in the situation: a lawyer, a counselor, an advocate from Adult Protective Services, a financial advisor, someone who can look at your situation objectively and tell you if your concerns are valid. In my case, David was that person. But there are resources available, even if you don't have a friend with a lawyer's son. Understand that confronting the exploitation will likely damage or end relationships. This is painful but necessary. You can't protect relationships with people who are actively harming you. Some family members will side with the exploiters. Some will refuse to believe it's happening. Some will blame you for causing drama. This is the cost of protecting yourself, and as much as it hurts, it's worth it. Also be prepared for the exploiters to escalate when confronted. They might try harder to isolate you. They might spread lies about you to other family members. They might threaten you or try to intimidate you into backing down. This is why having help and documentation is crucial. You can't fight this alone, and you shouldn't have to. Recovery takes time. Even after the legal battles are over, even after you've regained control of your assets, the emotional damage remains. Betrayal by people you trusted changes you. It makes you more cautious, more guarded, sometimes more suspicious. Therapy helps. Support groups help. Time helps. But the scars don't fully disappear, and that's okay. Scars are proof you survived something difficult. The specific lesson I want people to take from my story is this: real steps to get out and rebuild are possible, but they require action. Hoping the situation will improve on its own doesn't work. Waiting for the exploiters to suddenly develop a conscience doesn't work. You have to decide you're worth fighting for, and then you have to fight. Document everything. Get help. Protect yourself financially. Rebuild your support network. Know your legal rights. And most importantly, believe yourself when something feels wrong. One more thing before I finish. If you're someone who knows a person in this situation, your role matters too. Don't assume they'll ask for help. Don't wait for them to tell you what's happening. Reach out. Ask specific questions. Offer specific help. If they say everything's fine but you have concerns, trust your instincts and keep checking in. Many victims of elder abuse don't recognize it as abuse. They think it's normal family dynamics, or they blame themselves for not being more capable. Outside perspective can literally save someone's life or future. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. I know it was long, and I know parts of it were difficult to hear. But if even one person recognizes themselves in what I went through and decides to take action, then sharing this was worth it. You deserve to live with dignity. You deserve to control your own life. You deserve to be treated with respect by the people who claim to love you. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. I want to hear from you. What city are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Have you experienced something similar, or do you know someone who has? And here's the big question I want you to think about and maybe comment on. If you were in my position, would you have fought back, or would you have let it go to keep the peace? There's no wrong answer. Every situation is different, and every person has to make their own choices. But I'd love to know what you think. If this story resonated with